Welcome to the Modern Mexico Podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. At the start of his second term in office, U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to blow up the U.S.-Mexico relationship and implement new tariffs that could disrupt cross-border supply chains and maybe even end the wave of nearshoring investment in Mexico. On today's episode of the podcast, we're looking at the question of just how vulnerable Mexico is to Trump's newest tariff threats. We are recording this episode on March 4th, 2025, the same day that Trump's proposed 25% tariffs on Mexico go into effect. Business leaders are already scrambling after Trump made it clear on March 3rd that he would actually carry through with his threat to impose punitive new tariffs on Mexico. Speaking at a press conference at the White House, Trump explained,
"But very importantly, tomorrow tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start. So they're going to have a tariff. So what they have to do is build their car plants, frankly, and other things in the United States." I would just say this to people in Canada or Mexico: if they're going to build car plants, the people that are doing them are much better off building here, because we have the market. We're the market where they sell the most. And so I think it's going to be very exciting for the automobile companies.
Is there any room left for Canada and Mexico to make a deal before midnight? And should we expect those Chinese tariffs, the extra 10%, to take effect tomorrow?
No room left for Mexico or for Canada. No, the tariffs, they're all set. They go into effect tomorrow. I mean, it's going to be very costly for people to take advantage of this country. They can't come in and steal our money and steal our jobs and take our factories and take our businesses and expect not to be punished. And they're being punished by tariffs. It's a very powerful weapon that politicians haven't used because they were either dishonest, stupid, or paid off in some other form.
Financial markets were quick to react, falling sharply after Trump's announcement. CBS News covered the story.
We are following breaking news. All three major American stock markets have closed down for the day after President Trump took questions about tariffs going into effect tomorrow against Mexico and Canada. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady joins us now in Studio 57 to talk about this. So, Kelly, let's be specific with what the tariffs are. 25% against all Mexican and Canadian imports. Now let's talk about what the markets did. The Dow down 700, S&P down 100, NASDAQ down almost 500. What's going on?
So if you pull up a chart of the Dow, right around when President Trump started taking questions about tariffs this afternoon, you're going to see this. It went off a cliff. And in fact, we were actually down over 900 points when it comes to the Dow at one point today. So those numbers that you just mentioned, they're definitely extreme. Markets have been trying to price in this question of tariffs. And I think what we heard today was President Trump saying, look, this is going to happen at 12:01. A lot of investors, a lot of companies were hoping, is this a negotiation tactic? Are we going to see an 11th hour deal like we saw a month ago, right? This was supposed to go back into effect at the beginning of February. But if you look particularly at the auto sector, Ford, GM, like Stellantis, they were all down significantly, over 2 to 3%, because these are the companies that have big plants in Mexico and Canada, and they're going to feel this as well as some of the retailers the most.
On today's episode of the podcast, we're looking at what the Trump 2.0 era might look like for Mexico over the next 4 years. Today, we're speaking to Diego Marroquin Bitar, an academic researcher who covers North America at the Wilson Center, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. Hi, Diego. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nathaniel. I'm happy to be here finally.
So, I wanted to ask you, for executives looking at investing in nearshoring in Mexico right now, how would you frame the political risk outlook at the start of the Trump 2.0 era? And right now, especially considering the new tariffs that Trump has just applied to Mexico today, do you think that executives should think about investing in Mexico as having a green light a yellow light, or a red light?
Well, I think in the immediate present is definitely a red light. When we were first talking about this podcast, I would have classified that as a yellow light, but I think at least for the present, it is going to be very difficult for companies to invest in either Mexico or Canada. And if you ask me, even for the US, the key for investors is certainty, and certainty is not there in Mexico, it's not there in Canada, it's not there in the US. Nevertheless, I still think that in the medium term, like once the dust settles, and I think it's going to settle pretty soon because the impact of tariffs is going to be pretty significant both for the US and for Mexico, then I still think that like Mexico's investment equation is still there, still strong macros, still open to foreign direct investment, still has the most dynamic border in the world, and is the top trade partner of the biggest economy in the world. So I would have to wait. But for today, it's still a red light.
Okay, interesting. So, yeah, that's definitely interesting that your take on the news and on the situation as you see it right now is that it is a red light level of risk for foreign investors looking at Mexico. And I think a lot of people might agree with you that in the medium term, it still might be more of a medium level of risk or a flashing yellow light for foreign investors. But we really have to wait and see what happens. And I think the big word of the day might be uncertainty. I know that there's a tool called the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a measurement designed by a group of US business school academics, and right now it's actually at an all-time high. And the uncertainty index has actually surpassed the estimate for uncertainty that was recorded during the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that's a pretty wild indicator of just how unprecedented this situation is. And we're speaking on March 4th, 2025, and we know that for a while Trump's threatened tariffs were initially postponed a few times, but
Mm-hmm.
as of today, executives and investors really have to start thinking about what the impact of these 25% tariffs will be. And in early 2025, we were already seeing some evidence that business leaders and consumers in the US were already switching to a cautious wait and see mode regarding decisions on spending. But for a while, financial markets proved to be pretty buoyant and resilient despite the risk. But now, as we're seeing Trump take action, and
Mm-hmm.
rather than just making threats, he's moving forward with these tariffs, and we see that very quickly financial markets have been reacting negatively. And as of today, Mexico has announced that it will implement some retaliatory tariffs of its own.
Right.
And I think that a lot of people in the business community are still trying to figure out what's going on. I think many policy analysts and business leaders have come to see Trump as being kind of a masterful marketer, but
Mm-hmm.
something of an inept policymaker. And I think moving forward, there's still going to be a lot of questions about whether Trump's 2025 tariff threats are just posturing, or if they really represent a fundamental long-term shift in U.S. policies and priorities. And with that in mind, I wanted to take a look at Mexico specifically, and I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
ask you, how vulnerable do you think Mexico is to Trump's tariff threats right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, before we get into the vulnerability part, I think there's 2 points that I want to make. As you said, we have sheer uncertainty right now, but what we have to keep in mind still is that this like North American economic integration project started almost 40 years ago, and like electoral cycles are much shorter compared to that. So we have to keep in mind that. I think for this is going to be an incredibly impactful day for our region's trajectory so far, but I don't think it's going to get us to a completely different scenario from what we were working towards. Then the second point that you make regarding posturing, I think you're completely right. I think Trump 1.0 used tariffs as a bargaining chip, and that was the extent, at least with Mexico and Canada, and that was the extent of their use. But I think that right now tariffs are used for different things, more than just a concession extraction tool that was used, for example, in 2017. Tariffs are being used to undermine Mexico's and Canada's nearshoring potential. And I think this is something that they're doing on purpose. They're making manufacturing in Mexico and Canada less attractive vis-a-vis manufacturing in the US. So more than just a bargaining chip, it is an industrial policy tool. And President Trump was voted, got to the White House for those very reasons. So it was expected from him to do that. And he's doing that just a couple of weeks from being inaugurated. As I said, trade integration will suffer, but we've been doing this for 40 years. It's too costly to dismantle our supply chain. It's too costly to get rid of our joint infrastructure. Nevertheless, this decision is going to have real consequences for businesses and consumers. And in the particular case of Mexico, going back to your question, Mexico is the Mexican economy is one of the most open economies in the world. We have trade agreements with a bunch of countries, but specifically with the US, we have a very asymmetrical relationship. The sizes of our economies are very different, and it's also very interdependent. 80% of Mexico's GDP relies on trade. 40% of that is directly associated with exports, and 85% of our exports go to the US. We are recording this podcast for 30 minutes, let's say. We trade $1.8 million every minute. So for the duration of the podcast, Mexico and the US are going to be trading approximately $54 million. The US relies on the Mexican economy for key goods. We can talk about those in key states. Actually, 31 states have Mexico as their first, second, or third top trading partner. But Mexico's dependence to the US economy is on a completely different level. There's no other country in the world that was exposed to this risk as Mexico, not even Canada. As I said, 82% of our exports go to the US. If you suddenly put a 25% tax on all your exports, on the engine of the Mexican economy, then suddenly Mexico's is in a really tough spot. We had very low growth projections for this year, and according to different estimates, if tariffs are imposed as they have been, and then Mexico retaliates, Mexico could go into recession, most likely.
So you mentioned a couple of very interesting concepts there, and one, of course, is interdependency. Mexico's economy is very much plugged into the US economy. But you also use the word asymmetric, and I think that that's also important, that this cross-border relationship has been built up during the NAFTA era, and a lot of businesses have invested in supply chains that span both sides of the border. But at the end of the day, Mexico seems to be a little bit more vulnerable than the US, and I think that asymmetry is something that Trump looks at and thinks that he can take advantage of.
Leverage it, yeah.
We know that exports account for around a third of Mexico's GDP. And as you said, in a typical year, over 80% of Mexico's exports are going to the US. And on the other hand, US exports of goods to Mexico only account for around 1% of the US's GDP. So I think that Trump knows that on any given day he could provoke an immediate recession in Mexico by shutting down cargo truck crossings at the US border. And I think that asymmetry presents Trump with an opportunity to try and bully Mexico. But I also think that even though Mexico is vulnerable when it comes to Trump's latest tariff threats, unlike countries like Colombia and Ukraine, Mexico also has pressure points of its own that it can look to push during these negotiations. And I think that officials in Mexico's government know that Trump faces a very complex task when it comes to negotiating deals with Mexico on a wide range of cross-border issues, on everything from trade and investment to security and organized crime, and also migration flows. So, with that complexity in mind, I wanted to ask, who do you think are the key stakeholders who may try and influence Trump or to push back on the idea of imposing long-term tariffs on imports from Mexico?
Well, you make a few solid points there. Asymmetry and interdependence are the key pillars of the US-Mexico relation. But all cards on the table, I mean, I think Mexico has plenty to negotiate with. Like we don't even have to get into the border, security, like Mexico's immigrant community in the US. Just looking at on the trade side of things, for example, you said that the US exports close to 15, 17 of what they produce to Mexico, as as a share of the total. But if we go sector by sector, or if we go state by state, industry by industry, that's where we start to see this interdependence. For example, the auto sector. Mexico is one of the largest auto producers in the world. Over 70% of US auto parts imports come from Mexico. If you add Canada, we get to 90%. Energy, for example, oil and gas imports that the US buys, 60% come from Canada, 11% they come from Mexico. That's close to 70% of what all the oil and gas that the US imports every year comes from these two countries. I mean, some people have been arguing that the US can produce all this energy on its own, but in fact, if you looked at the specifics, a bunch of refineries in the US, like the US oil is sweeter, is lighter compared to Canadian and Mexican oil. And some of those refineries in the US were specifically made to refine Mexican and Canadian oil. So I mean, there's a really real interest from certain economies, certain states. For example, you're talking about stakeholders. I think agriculture is a big one. Just look at one product, corn. Over 90% of the corn that Mexico imports from abroad comes from the US. Almost, the US is the largest exporter of corn to Mexico by far, almost $5 billion each year, and that figure keeps rising, by the way. There are states like Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri that export their corn, over 90% of their corn to Mexico. So on the one hand, you see that Mexican families need those imports to put food on the table. But on the other hand, there are hundreds, thousands of US farmers that rely on the Mexican market to thrive and to prosper. And suddenly, if there's tariffs put in place for those goods, they're going to be less competitive, and they're likely going to be economic losses. So I think agriculture is a big one. Pork producing states, apples, US whiskey from Kentucky, for example, they are all going to get impacted by tariffs. And if we recall what happened in 2017, those were the main actors that approached the Trump administration, agribusiness and manufacturing. It is going to be very difficult for the US to remain competitive and to still to innovate without the Mexican labor force, without Mexico's industrial base, and without Canadian energy.
So you mentioned agriculture and manufacturing, and I definitely think corn in particular is a big one where corn producers in the U.S. will certainly want to interact with the Trump administration about what the long-term vision for the U.S.-Mexico relationship is. But when it comes to manufacturing, I recently took a look at the data on vehicle exports from Mexico to the US, and something that really jumps out at me is the idea that Ford and GM are by far the biggest exporters of cars from Mexico to the US. So it seems like executives at Ford and GM might end up being very strong behind the scenes advocates for avoiding any type of major disruption to the existing US-Mexico trade relationship. And another thing that I see is that Mexico is also the biggest buyer of goods from California and Texas, and those are the two biggest state economies in the US. So I think that politicians in those two powerhouse state economies might also want to work to communicate their constituents' priorities to members of the Trump team.
Hmm.
And I think that when we really look at the details of who is doing the business that contributes to these imports and exports across the US-Mexico border, I think that there's a big idea here that any disruption to this existing trade relationship might end up hurting both Mexico and the US. And we've already seen today and yesterday that financial markets in the US have been shaken by Trump's announcement to carry through with his tariffs on Mexico. And
Hmm.
I think that if these tariffs end up causing a significant sell-off of the S&P 500 or provoke any major spike in inflation, consumers and investors in the US might very quickly end up being other key stakeholder groups who will be pretty vocal about voicing their discontent with the tariff policy. And when we think about the long-term impact of potential tariffs, or if we're really going to see a kind of a toxic turn in the US-Mexico relationship, I wanted to ask you about the risk of a total collapse of the US-Mexico relationship. And I wanted to know if you think that's a risk in any way that we see Mexico and the US going from kind of being amigos to being antagonists, or do you think it's
Hmm.
likely that President Sheinbaum will be able to reach a deal with Trump that keeps the existing trade framework intact?
Well, you never want to be an enemy of your neighbor. We, like, as a Mexican, with both the US and Mexico have experienced this, as you said, we went from being distant neighbors over the last century to being strategic partners, and like there might not be that recognition anymore at the federal level in the US. But as we said, the facts on the ground remain the same. But we created something that's too good to just toss. I was just looking at the numbers, but and we ran a model back then when I was working at Brookings, but close to 4 to 5 million jobs depend on USMCA trade. Could be potentially many more if you add the jobs are created by secondary services like logistics, for example. You mentioned the auto sector. It is going to be very difficult for the U.S. auto sector to compete. I've talked to some friends here in DC. The auto sector has very tight margins already. There's no way that they're going to be able to compete with the Chinese auto industry or with the EU auto industry if suddenly their inputs become more expensive. Some of the auto parts that are traded between both countries. It is not that we trade, we produce things together. So that if Mexico puts together an engine and then Mexico sends the engine to the US so that they can add the brakes to it, and then it moves back to Mexico, and they do the paint job, for example. Like it moves from 10 to 20 times. So I mean, there's exponential effects to tariffs because every time that good crosses the border, it needs to pay that 25%. Um, so I think the consumers in the US are going to feel, I mean, I think we're going to feel it first in Mexico, given, again, our deep interdependence and the asymmetry of the bilateral relation. But I think US consumers are going to get impacted very soon. I don't think US companies or importing firms are going to be able to absorb all these costs for a long time, especially for perishables, for example. Like next time you go to the supermarket to buy your Corona or to buy your avocados or to buy your tequila or tomatoes or berries, which by the way are Mexico is still the number one exporter for all those categories. They're going to be more expensive, and I think that's going to have a direct impact for consumers And if you add that pressure from consumers with that with pressure from the traditional stakeholders, I think we might see a policy reversal sooner rather than later. And I think that's going to come pretty soon. Because if we add Mexican tariffs potentially on Sunday, Monday, and then Canadian tariffs, the U.S. economy is going to feel it. Perhaps not as much as Mexico. When we have this phrase that whenever the U.S. gets the flu, Mexico gets pneumonia. Everyone's going to feel it. Perhaps Mexico first, but the U.S. is going to follow, and then the pressure is just going to keep adding up as it did in 2017.
So I think that a few weeks ago, probably many policy analysts and business executives would assume that it would be highly likely that Sheinbaum would end up reaching a deal with Trump that would prevent these tariffs from taking effect. But
Mm-hmm.
as of today, that doesn't look like it's the case. And I think that right now, the most important question is, does Trump actually want to make a deal with Mexico to avert tariffs? And
Yeah.
the way that Trump and his advisors are talking about tariffs, they seem to zigzag between describing tariffs as being a punitive measure for fentanyl inflows
Mm-hmm.
and alternatively talking about them as being a viable long-term economic strategy. So, on the one hand, it does seem like Scheinbaum is well positioned to negotiate a new deal for cross-border relations, but the wild card here is Trump. And to me, it seems like it's still very unclear if Mexico can really make a deal with Trump. I think the question is, are these tariffs just a tactic for bullying Mexico during the broader negotiations? Or are
Mm-hmm.
we really starting to see some kind of uh, improvised experiment with radically shaking up the global trade system? And I do think it's important to highlight how much is at stake. We've talked a lot about the business relationship between the US and in Mexico today, but Mexico is also the top destination for tourists from the US, and a record-breaking 13 million tourists from the US flew into Mexico in 2024. And in total, last year, Mexico earned $33 billion from tourism. So usually we'd look at that trend of cross-border tourism as a positive thing for commerce and for cultural exchange, but I think that this interdependency could also be used as a threat at some point during an escalating trade war. For instance, Trump could threaten to temporarily ban travel by U.S. citizens to Mexico, or Mexico could propose implementing a costly new visa for tourists from the U.S. who want to visit Mexico. So we can imagine a variety of ways where the U.S.-Mexico relationship could become more hostile, but I think there's a real risk that if Mexico fundamentally stops seeing the U.S. as an amigo and an ally, the relationship could really deteriorate. And in particular, I think that if Trump pushes forward with any type of unilateral military action on Mexican soil, that could be very, very hard for Mexico's government to accept. So, just as a thought exercise, I think that it can be
Mm-hmm.
helpful to think about a potential worst case scenario. And for instance, sometimes I wonder, is there some kind of dystopian outcome here where Mexico ends up pivoting towards China and welcoming in Chinese investments and Chinese military cooperation? And I honestly don't really think that's a likely scenario, but I also think that the risk of that type of outcome means that Trump really needs to be cautious about how much he antagonizes Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this cross-border relationship is really pretty remarkable when we look at neighboring countries around the world. And with all the cultural, economic, and geographic ties that tie the two countries together, I think that we are really more like roommates than just neighbors. And I think it's very important for people who are providing Trump with policy guidance right now to be very clear about explaining that a total breakdown of the relationship with Mexico would end up being a pretty costly mistake. And
Mhm.
with that in mind, I think Trump needs to be very aware that there's a limit to how much he can bully Mexico. And um, with that in mind, I actually wanted to ask you, when you look at how President Sheinbaum has dealt with Trump so far, what grade
Mhm.
would you give her for the way she's handled the negotiations with Trump so far?
Well, there's a lot to dissect there. I think you're right when you say be careful what you wish for. Even in Canada, I've been in Canada a few times for the past 2 months, and even in Canada, Canada, for I mean, very different reasons, has distanced itself from China. Um, but some people in Canada are talking about like, hey, maybe Chinese investment is not too bad after all. And that has happened as well in Latin America. I think, as you said, the trade paradigm as we know it, it's completely unraveling, and we're going to get to a completely different situation. Nevertheless, I think that the U.S.-Mexico relation and like trade we're going to continue again on this route. Um, there's no other bilateral relationship that impacts more lives in the US than the ties that the US has with Mexico and vice versa. Um, all the infrastructure that we've built together, the supply chains that again we also built together, they're not going to go anywhere. Um, and sooner that economic reality is going to settle in at at the White House. Tariffs are an industrial tool, no longer just a bargaining chip, as I said before. The border and security were the justification to use AIPA, but I think the real intent behind those tariffs, again, is to make manufacturing in the US more attractive vis-a-vis other countries, even if we're talking about key allies. The other point that I would like to highlight here is that as well as the trade paradigm is changing, I think the whole international system is going to change. We're no longer going to talk about partnerships as we used to, Mexico being uh, one of the most important partners for the US for security, for trade, for the economy. But we're going to like look at relationships between countries from a much narrower viewpoint. We're talking about deals. So what can Mexico do in terms of security for the US? What deal can they reach um, for this sector or for other sectors? And I mean, Canada and Mexico did a lot on the border and a lot on security. Canada is going to invest $1.3 billion to invest in their border, securitize it. Mexico has again record level seizures of fentanyl and precursors. Uh, just last week, they handed out, not even extradited, 29 members of criminal organizations back more to the U.S. But as you said, it was never going to be enough because the intent of the tariffs was something completely different. Now, if we talk about President Sheinbaum's strategy, I think Sheinbaum's strategy has been much better compared to, for example, what Colombia did a couple of weeks ago, or what Canada has done so far. I think just like the announcement that we heard today, tariffs. President Simon said that Mexico is going to put tariffs on some U.S. goods. Again, not everything. And she's gonna today is Tuesday. She's gonna announce it on Sunday. So that gives her enough time to potentially negotiate a last minute deal, get some reprieve before she has to follow through with it. Number two, she's also talking to her base and the more nationalistic side of Morena. I think she's been cool-headed. Strategic about it. I mean, every time the Secretary of Art is here in DC, they met with their counterparts. They also met with Secretary of the Treasury to talk about, for example, Chinese, well, FDI investment screenings, particularly from China. So Mexico is working on the main irritants of the trade relationship, and it's delivering results. But as I said before, I don't think those results are going to take tariffs off the table, because tariffs are such a good tool for the U.S. to increase its leverage over other countries. Again, given our asymmetries, so tariffs were never going to get off the table. Nevertheless, I think what President China has done so far, it's good. I would wait until Sunday to change the grade, but for me now, I think it's an A. I wouldn't give it an A plus, because before, when we got over the last tariff threat, I think I think she didn't have to reveal her whole strategy during the morning conference. I think what she did this morning was a little better. Of course, because everyone knows where can Mexico put tariffs on the U.S. so that the U.S. feels the pressure. So you don't have to do it publicly, and I think they might be able to find some reprieve. I'm still hopeful, given the lasting economic consequences this would have for both countries.
So I think that's very interesting that you give Sheinbaum an A for her performance so far in negotiating with Trump. And I would have to agree that the general consensus in Mexico has to be that Sheinbaum has done a pretty good job with dealing with Trump so far. And I think that Trump also knows that in Sheinbaum, he really faces a peer who is very, very popular with voters and who enjoys a tight grip on the levers of governmental power. And so far, we haven't seen Trump publicly denigrating or trying to embarrass Sheinbaum. And up until now, Sheinbaum has really been able to stand up to Trump with a mix of public advocacy, private discussions, and even at times some humor. And I do think it's interesting that Sheinbaum has also worked to position herself as a champion for nearshoring, and she has repeatedly highlighted the benefits that cross-border trade bring to both the US and Mexico. But at the end of the day, her grade for dealing with Trump is going to be determined by the new arrangement that Mexico ends up negotiating with the US. And as of right now, she does say that she is planning to implement retaliatory tariffs of her own, and that does increase the risk of a collapse of the US-Mexico supply chain. But we really don't know how the story is going to unfold right now. And I think that overall, for the first year of the Trump-Sheinbaum era, the cross-border relationship is going to be defined by the concept of uncertainty. And I'm actually going to dig back into the archive and pull out something that I once said about Mexico's former president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. When it comes to Trump, I think that business leaders on both sides of the border have to figure out if Trump is really trying to be the hemisphere's newest authoritarian strongman, or whether he just wants to play the role of one on TV. And I think that foreign executives also really have to figure out if Trump is just making smoke with his threats to Mexico, or if he really plans on setting the existing nearshoring framework on fire. And those are questions that we're going to have to try to follow and answer over the coming weeks and months. But right now, it's still an open-ended question. But overall, I want to say it was super interesting to hear your perspective on this topic, and I want to say thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you like what you heard on the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, Hasta luego, amigos.